Hi everyone. This video is, I guess I think it's kind of a privilege to make this video, but it's also the most difficult video I probably have ever made. And it's going to be hopefully a useful introduction to Owen Barfield. So building on Steiner last week, we're now going into Owen Barfield, and I think adding Owen Barfield to Steiner really fills out the picture in a very kind of beautiful way. And it, for me at least, creates something convincing. And I just want to say, start out by saying a few things sort of personally in the sense, and then maybe my connection to Barfield will make sense, more sense to you. For at least the last 15 years or so, probably longer at this point, I've found myself intuitively drawn to reading Owen Barfield, about Owen Barfield, and beyond that, actually, too. So there's kind of a thread that I'd say it's a historical thread that you can draw from Wolfgang Goethe in Germany in the 1700s through to Rudolf Steiner, through Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the British poet, to Owen Barfield. That's at least one thread. And so I have found myself intuitively drawn to try and understand that thread that basically starts with Goethe, and it has powerfully influenced me, even though I honestly don't feel I fully understand it at all. So what I have grasped from it has been very important to me, and I just want to say a little about that. In a sense, my own journey as a scientist, leaving science and coming to now, so through religious studies at Naropa and on to now, that thread led me to me the vital role of nature. For me, nature became my sort of portal to spirituality, to the divine, and that's been expressed in my work as a hiking guide here, where I sort of do try to pass on some of this connection that nature provides me, and if I can express it in a way, it's just that we don't exist separate from nature. I started to experience this. We exist profoundly with nature, and that is captured by this word relationship. So for me, there's a deep relationship with nature, and that relationship, like any relationship, is a two-way relationship, right? It has to be two-way. So and a lot of this is happening at unconscious levels, but you can sort of begin to touch in, begin to become conscious of the two-way interaction with nature, and particularly in the forms of what I would call the feeling of love. And that's what I experience out there, that there's a love that is two-way, from me to nature and from nature to me. And but it's a kind of intimacy that I'm not sure that we can really describe, actually. But it's been very important to me, and I try to pass on something of this relationship that I at times at least experience more than others. Try to pass it on, try to open or plant a seed in the people that I take on hikes. And sometimes people are not open at all to that, and sometimes people are very open to it. So it's a very variable thing. But really, this relationship that I have with nature connects totally, and maybe I owe it to this thread of philosophy that I'm talking about that goes from Goethe to Steiner to Coleridge to Barfield, and particularly, I guess, to Barfield. Barfield is, so he lived basically throughout. He was born at the end of the 1800s and lived almost to the end of the last century. So he lived a long life, and published a lot of books and had a life, some of which you'll learn about. And there's something and he was, his what a lot of people, many people don't know who he is. And he's, I wouldn't say that he's well known except in certain circles, but if he's known at all, it's for being one of this group of writers called the Inklings that were created at Oxford and met in this Oxford pub. So between the two wars, I think primarily, and so the Inklings consisted of a number of different writers, but most notably C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were members of the Inklings, as well as a number of others, and Owen Barfield. And they all of them revered Owen Barfield, even though they didn't necessarily totally agree with him. So I think if a time traveler were to arrive on my doorstep and give me the chance for a trip back to one period of time, I'd go back and sit with the Inklings and listen to their conversations. I think that would have been really something. Anyway, so what I want to say about Barfield is that he, I think one can primarily say that he used language. So he became very convinced that there was an evolution of consciousness. And he became convinced of that through his study of the history of the use of language, so the meanings of words, as they are made apparent in different eras through different works of literature and otherwise. And one could watch the meanings of words change over time. And from that, he sort of deduced that there must be a kind of change of consciousness, that we have such an intimate relationship with language that it really is an expression. He likened it to the use of paleontology to determine the evolution of life on Earth, for example. Language is the paleontology of consciousness, essentially. And I'm not going to talk so much about the actual change in words here, but one of the radical ideas that he noticed was that, first is this idea that words have a kind of soul. In other words, you say a word, and actually we may understand its meaning, we may take in its meaning, but it also has a kind of felt quality to it, a feeling quality that we register. And this is the soul of words. And his idea is that this soul of words has changed over time and in a sense has become shallower and shallower. And so as you go back in time, the depth of meaning in a word increases in such a way that words that refer to outside things, ordinary outside things outside of us, as you go back in time, you find that they also referred to inside things. And one example of this would be the word matter. Okay, matter is an outside thing, right? But where it derives from in Latin is the word mother, right? And so and that being not referring to the outer mother, but to this inner concept of mother. You see what I mean? So that the word mother, the word matter, in a way, was richer in meaning in the past, and this applies to other words. The one particular word that's used is the word for spirit or wind. In Greek, the word is pneuma, and in Hebrew, it's ruach. And both of those words, pneuma and ruach, meant wind, breath, and spirit. All three. It meant all three. Now, what has happened over time is that word that referred to all three of those things has split. And so now it means specifically this: breath, wind, spirit, kind of thing. And it's split. But the single word contains with all of that within it. And when it was used, one would know what it meant depending on context, but also it would carry with it all of that meaning. So you couldn't use the word breath without also implying spirit. And so there was, what you see in the past was a greater kind of unity. You see what I mean? And a greater involvement of our consciousness with the world. So a greater, I would say, a lesser separation between ourselves and the world. In fact, Owen Barfield called it participation. So he calls this original participation. So really, it's prior to the Greeks, the time of, sort of roughly the time of Socrates. Prior to that, then we existed totally in a time of what he calls original participation. We saw ourselves not intellectually. We experienced ourselves as participants in the world, right, in nature. And so our inner world and the inner part of the outer world, and this is a concept that gets introduced really by Barfield, that the world has an inner aspect. Everything has an inner aspect, basically. And so the inner part of ourselves and the inner part of the world were essentially a unity. And we didn't see ourselves separate. What occurred within and what occurred without were intimately related, basically. And this is revealed in language and how the words were used at those times. This sort of sense of participation started to slowly be eroded over time, but was still present into the Middle Ages. But where it really came to an end is with the sort of middle late Renaissance and the what we call the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution. That's where it really came. And what happened is we changed from being this participant to what Barfield calls onlookers, where we have onlooker consciousness. So we look at the outer world. We have our inner world, which is essentially confined to us, right here, and we look out onto the world around us. We look out onto the outer part of the world around us. We no longer see the inner part of the world around us. We look at the outer, and so what has happened is an increasing sort of separation, an increasing alienation from the world, from nature, essentially, and hence ultimately from ourselves, right? So so what we see when we look out at the world, and this really corresponds to science and the scientific method of knowing the world, is we see the outer aspect of the outer world, and that is what we've slowly come to believe is real. And inner aspects. Now we can see most that we have inner aspects, but what we've done is even tried to turn that into an outer aspect, right? So the inner aspect, our feelings, our thoughts, are reduced to electrochemical activity in our brains and nervous system and so on. So that's an outer phenomenon. It turns into an outer phenomena. So, so we have tried to turn the world into an outside-only world. See what I mean? This is what Barfield is saying, and this, what the result is that we have essentially a world that has no meaning and can have no meaning, and it's a sort of dry and in a way dead mechanical world. And Rudolf Steiner would use the word dead. I think you can see the parallel with Steiner here, which is, in Steiner we had picture consciousness, which was it equals Barfield's original participation in a sense. So that we didn't have this sense of the separate I, the separate self. The I, the ego, is something that developed after that time, around the time of Socrates, 400 BC-ish. Around that time was the emergence of this sort of sense of self, and thought prior to this kind of belonged to the world, and it was very much more symbolic than our thought is. Our thought is much more language based, and our identity was towards the collective. Right? We identified kind of with the world, not apart from it. And then over time, what happened was this developing sense of I, the I-ness, and with the consequent loss of this connection to the world's wisdom, to the divine even. And I think that's interesting, an interesting perspective. So we get to the present time, and we find ourselves alienated from the world and kind of from ourselves. And so Barfield's prescription, similar to Steiner, for recovery, and both Barfield and Steiner think that this evolutionary journey, though unfortunate, was necessary, that we needed to gain this sort of freedom, especially in our thinking, via thinking, and that the world somehow needs this, see, from us. But if we do not recover the participation aspect, or what Steiner calls spirit, if we do not recover that, then we're in for a bad go of it, basically. And so this is the necessary kind of job of our age, is to begin this journey back to what Barfield calls final participation. So we will realize that we are still actually participants in the world, because this is only the world we've kind of created with our thinking about the world, right? And our thinking about thinking. We've created this world where we appear separate from it, and this world of outer appearances. And so and that ultimately is kind of illusory. And the truth is that the world has an interior, and that our interior is intimately related to the world, and that we need to recover this participation, this intimate relationship, but without losing our onlooker consciousness, our ability to have onlooker consciousness, our freedom of thought. And so this he doesn't believe has happened yet in our culture. I mean, it has happened in individuals, and to some degree, and it may happen in you or I at moments that we recover this sense of participation. We suddenly feel the intimate connection with the world. In that intimate connection, what happens is you perceive a kind of deeper strain in the world, which is ultimately sacred, divine kind of thing. And so that the response is one of, almost like a sense of being connected to God in a way. When you recover this sense of participation, which is kind of like the whole. And I do think that we have these experiences, and we may call them spiritual experiences at the time. I'm not sure if all spiritual experiences would fall into that category, but this is the overview of this sort of stream of development that Barfield illuminated with his study of language, and that he then discovered matched very well with this recent part of history, because Steiner goes way back into the whole Atlantis-Lemuria thing, but this is post-Atlantean. So this more recent, his view, what he discovered from the evolution of language, or the change in the use of language and the evolution of consciousness, matches very well. He felt it matched very well with Steiner. And so there's a connection there. And then, in fact, Barfield was an anthroposophist, so he and a Christian, but he very much ascribed to the kind of work and philosophical view that came out of Steiner, anthroposophy. But I think his work elucidates it in a very much deeper way. One aspect of this is that our conclusions on the nature of the world, and we've talked about this a little, but the world then has this interior aspect, according to Barfield. So, and I'm not sure what Steiner would say, but spirit is involved in the world. And in fact, the world is essentially sort of ultimately spirit. But and what happens is that anything that you might look at, like say a tree or really anything, from the view of onlooker consciousness, the tree appears to you as the outer part of the tree, the bark that you can touch and the leaves, etc., etc. But the tree has an inner aspect, and that when one recovers a little of the participatory consciousness, one starts to see into, and Barfield uses the word through. You see through the tree. C.S. Lewis called it along. You see along the tree. It takes you to this deeper stream. You become aware through the tree of the deeper stream that is really the tree. You become aware of the real tree. What we see is what he would call a kind of a sign, and we mistake the sign for the tree itself. So the tree is a sign. The outside of the tree, the mere outer part of the tree, is kind of like a sign, but we take that sign for the thing itself, instead of following the sign to where it points, if you see what I mean, and then having that experience that takes you into intimate connection with the tree and then probably everything else, right? So, and what happens is, because of this inner being more important than outer, if you see what I mean, the world we experience is essentially sort of fluid in response to our consciousness, so that we how our consciousness is changes how the world appears to us, right? Because it's in this interaction that the world appears. And so the current world that we experience, which is a world of objects, with us separate from them, is a world that we've essentially created. Isn't the truth, but it's a world that we've essentially created. And the truth is wholly different, right? Much more profound. And so as our consciousness evolves, then for Barfield, the world evolves. To all purposes, the world evolves, right? We don't know what really happens to if there's a real world out there. We don't know that, but the world that we know and interact with, that evolves. And so the evolution of consciousness is the evolution of the world. What this means is that you cannot go back and look at, say, the ancient Greeks or ancient humans and judge them by our current standards, by our current consciousness, right? Because the people and the world were different back then, right? And so it was a different world. We can't experience that except in these little hints and glimpses that we get. And these hints and glimpses are hugely important. Now, Barfield came to many of these hints and glimpses through poetry. Poetry was immensely important to Barfield. He observed that you could read certain poems, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but you probably have, where you read certain poems and they strike you. Like they even a particular phrase within a poem, it kind of reaches you and it kind of hits this gong, and the world, for a second, the world kind of changes. Your consciousness shifts, right? And this happens through metaphor, and that in metaphor, that only exists in consciousness, right? In thought, in mind. So when you encounter a poem or a piece of writing that has this effect on you, that sort of changes, it's like the kaleidoscope, it turns the wheel and things rearrange, then that's a little taste of participation, I think. And so poetry and poets, true poets, were really important to Barfield. And the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was his favorite poet, realized this kind of thing as well. And in fact, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was quite the philosopher, not known to many, and so he wrote on, particularly on the imagination, detailing the poetic imagination. And imagination also is another thing that's really important to Barfield, because the important missing ingredient today is just that. It's the missing ingredient of imagination. It takes imagination, which we tend to say it's just your imagination. So we talk about imagination in a way minimizing it. But when you think about imagination, what it does, it's the most remarkable phenomena. And this occurs, of course, in dreams and other things, but imagination, what one can do with one's imagination is really a reflection of creation, essentially. But so imagination is enormously important, and it's that faculty, the faculty of imagination, that will enable us to straddle this gap that we've created, this alienation from ourselves and the world. It's via imagination. It's like the discovery of imagination in its formative form, if you see what I mean. Because imagination is really ultimately, I think, what creates the world. And This actually relates to Vedic philosophy. So if you go back to the Vedas, and what you find there in the Vedas, the Rig Veda and other Vedas, which are ancient, right, is the idea that imagination is incredibly important. Hence, all of the ceremonies and things that were important religiously, spiritually for them. But they saw that the gods created the world with imagination, and that we basically had a smaller kind of stepped down version of that ability, that their use of imagination to make creation, to make the universe, we have it, and therefore we can create. And this was what was really important to Coleridge, is this, let's look at this thing, creation and imagination, and let's see if we can go deeper, tease it apart kind of thing. So imagination then is this power of the gods that we have. And we have to think that imagination doesn't just happen in our kind of very conscious use of imagination, that we're using imagination all the time unconsciously. And we might talk more about how we do this, but we do. And in fact, we couldn't have a world without it. And it relates very much to thinking and mind, and how we have a world at all. So anyway, I don't know if this serves as a introduction to Barfield that will help you with the reading. I'm going to give you reading that I don't think is easy, at least in places. And so you're going to have to tell me when it becomes, when and if it becomes sort of incomprehensible, and then we can sort of work our way through it and see if it can be made comprehensible. But anyway, let's try it. I'm giving you this sort of article. It's a book chapter actually from a guy called Stephen Talbot, and it's on Barfield and his ideas. I'm also going to give you a sort of simpler. So I would say that Talbot leads you in where you need to go, but in terms of a sort of a stepped back overview that won't take you as deep, the Owen Barfield Society, the organization, I think it comes from his family ultimately, has a short course on Barfield. It's very quick to read. I read it in maybe 20 minutes, the whole thing. And I'm going to give you a link to that, and you can go, it's in parts. Let's see, it has 6 parts. And we only really need to read the first 3, maybe the first 4 to get it. And so hopefully they'll be complementary. You'll read this article by Stephen Talbot, which is relatively long, and I recommend to you that, I was at St. John's College in Santa Fe for a while. It's a great book school, and there was a lot of reading. I was doing a master's degree in Eastern Classics, and we would have tons of reading each week, but they said, you got to read everything twice. Don't read it once. Well, I would say, especially with the article from Stephen Talbot, see if you get the chance to read it twice. Go through it twice, because you'll find it speaks a lot more to you. It steps forward on the second reading, and then in the future on a third reading and a fourth reading and so forth. Because to get this, and if there's even a grain of truth, or halfway truth in Barfield and Steiner, then we have to be able to truly get this, we have to be able to kind of step outside of our own current modern consciousness, right? And that is not an easy thing to do. It takes, hammering on it quite a bit to create these cracks. And this has been my experience over the years, is that the cracks have gotten wider over time, to such that the truth of this Barfield view, and to some extent Steiner's view, has become more and more relevant over time, because I think I start to experience what he's saying. I started to have experiences of what he's saying, and there's a very I don't know if it's well known, but there's a sort of powerful quote from St. Augustine, so way back, where he says, you shouldn't try and understand so that you then believe in something. It works the other way around. You have to believe in something so that you understand it, and so that it's like belief. Understanding follows belief, not vice versa. And what we try to do is to grasp things with our understanding, with our intellectual minds. We try to grasp them that way. But that's not the way to understanding. You have to flip it around. You have to say, you know what? I'm going to entertain this idea. I'm going to, sort of let it change me. Let this idea change me, and believe it, at least to the degree I can, and see how my understanding changes. And that's been my experience with Barfield, is that intuitively I'm like, there's something really important here that I need to understand. And in a way, I got it enough that I said, you know what, I'm gonna let this idea in, believe it kind of on some level. And then slowly over time, it has sort of convinced me of its validity, not like it's the only way to look at things necessarily, but it reveals an aspect to the world that we have lost in the West, and that is desperately in need of being recovered, I think, if we're to do anything with this experiment called humanity. So we'll see. Anyway, that's maybe all I've got to say. I probably could have done a much better job of going over this, but there it is, this and your writing. Let's see what happens. And we do have a Zoom on Tuesday, which we could maybe wrestle with this together. Okay, thanks, bye-bye.